Hi guys, this is day 27 of the AS Economics 42-day revision challenge, and today we are doing types of trade protection. Before we talk about types of trade protection, let's talk about when does a country import. A country imports when the price of the goods that it has domestically is higher than the world prices. So a case which we are going to show right now will be where the world price is lower than domestic price. So we can see this diagram where demand and supply is meeting at price P naught. Let's say P naught is the domestic price. Now if the world price is somewhere below, let's say this one, let's say this is my world supply. So if the world supply is like this, then PW, let's say it's the world price, then we can say this that the world price is lower than the domestic price. And if such is the case, then basically there will be Q2 of goods that will be demanded domestically, but only Q1 of the goods will be supplied domestically. Now why is that the case? Let me explain the whole idea that at PW price, the world supply curve is meeting at the quantity Q2. If the price was P naught, only Q naught consumers would have been buying the good. Because the price has gone down to PW, now Q2 consumers are also buying the goods. Similarly, because now the world price is PW, some domestic producers who are not able to match the price because the price is too low will go out of market. So only Q1 producers who are having a supply curve from here, let's call this point to be A, from A to B are the ones who are able to match the price PW, and therefore Q1 is what we call domestic supply. So let me write this. Q1 is what we call our domestic supply. Q2 is our domestic demand, and therefore what we can look at is this gap Q2 minus Q1. This Q2 minus Q1 is what we call our level of imports. So we are importing because the domestic price is higher than the world price. Now, why is supply curve perfectly elastic? Well, this means that at PW price, the world's producers can produce any quantity that the world requires. Now, from domestic consumers' perspective, this is great news. Why? Because previously price was P naught and consumer surplus was this triangle. Let's call it X, Y, P naught was the consumer surplus, because consumer surplus is the area under the demand curve above the market price. So X, Y, P naught was the consumer surplus. But when the price went down to, let's say, PW, consumer surplus went up to X, let's call this Z, XZPW, which means this area is all my rise in consumer surplus because the price has gone down. So we can see the benefit of trade happening here, where the consumer surplus has gone up and domestic producers who are not efficient are producing less. Q0 minus Q1 are those domestic producers who are not producing anymore because now this amount is being imported. Similarly, Q2 minus Q0 consumers who were previously not getting the good are now getting the good. So this is good news for both the domestic consumers as well as world efficiency, as now the welfare is going up. Let's now look at the case of when does a country export. And we say a country will export whenever the price, let me write this, whenever the world price is above the domestic price. And I'm going to show this in a diagram. let's say this is demand and supply for a good, let's say t-shirts, and let's say P naught is the domestic price, and what if I tell you the world price is PW, and this world price PW is basically above the equilibrium. So if the world price is above the equilibrium, clearly domestic price is lower. So domestic producers, what they realize is just that if the world is offering them a better price, first of all, they will produce more. They will produce more because now they realize that they can now sell this good in the foreign market for a better price. Similarly, domestic consumers will realize is that if PW is the world price and let's say producers are now trying to match PW price, then the domestic producers will try to sell it at PW, which means domestic consumers will not be able to afford the good. So what happens basically is this, that Q2 becomes my level of in fact Q2 become my total domestic supply, while Q1 becomes my total domestic demand. Why? Because when the producers know that PW is the price that is being offered, they will start selling even in the domestic market something for PW or the same quality for PW, which would mean Q2 minus Q1, this gap here, Q2 minus Q1 becomes my level of exports. So domestic producers will be encouraged to sell in the foreign market. So Q2 minus Q1 is the increased supply as compared to before, but domestic consumers, because they won't be able to pay the price PW, they will shy away from the market, and therefore Q1 will be the domestic consumption. This Q2 minus Q1, this excess sort of surplus, will now go into the foreign market to be sold. Now we'll use this knowledge of our export and import, but we'll use this knowledge to first look at our types of trade protection, and the first one we'll discuss is what we call a tariff. So what is a tariff? We say a tariff is a tax on imports. It results in the world supply curve to shift upward, because when you put a tax, the cost of production will go up, and as a result of this supply curve shifting upward, the price will go up in the domestic market. So it makes the import expensive, and when the import becomes expensive, people will buy less of imports automatically. Also, because the imports have become expensive, it results in the domestic producers to become more competitive in the market. So what we'll see once we see the diagram is this, that when you put a tax on imports, imports will fall, but domestic producers will sell more because the price has gone up. In the whole process, basically, what we'll also see is that consumers will suffer because of higher prices. So let's see the diagram of tariff to understand the impact of tariff a little more. So let's say this is demand and supply for lemons that are produced in Pakistan, and currently price is P0 and quantity is Q0. Now let's say world supply is below the domestic price, like P0. Let's say this is my world supply curve, and lemons are sold in the market for PW. So this is my world supply, and they are sold for PW, and as a result of this, Q2 is being demanded domestically while Q1 is being produced domestically, and therefore we have a level of imports of Q2 minus Q1. So before we put a tariff, let's say world price is PW and Q2 minus Q1 is being imported, and also the consumer surplus, let's see this, consumer surplus will be, let's say, A, B, PW. So before tariff, just write that, before tariff, our consumer surplus is A, PW, and Q2 minus Q1 is my level of imports when the price is PW, of course. Now, government, let's say, is very unhappy with the level of imports. They say this is too much imports and they want to reduce this import. And they say, let's just put a tariff, try to make this good expensive, put a tax of a certain amount. So then the government decides to put a tariff. The supply curve will shift upward like this. The world supply curve will now be PW plus T, where T is the amount of tariff. So this becomes my world supply, but with tariff. So when we do that, when you put a tariff, the world supply curve shifts upward, and that results in now the new domestic consumption to be Q4, while the new domestic production to be Q3. Now what you can see, first of all, is this, that because you put a tariff, some consumers are denied of the good. Q2 minus Q4 are denied of the good. Why? Because the good is becoming expensive. Second, because the price has gone up from PW to PW plus T, some domestic producers are able to produce more. Previously, only Q1 were able to produce. Why? Because these were the producers who were able to sort of produce at price PW. And this could kind of like X2, let's call it X2, Y were those producers previously who were producing at PW. Now it's X to Z producers who are also, these extra producer Q3 minus Q1 are also producing more. So when you put a price of PW plus T, the domestic production goes up to Q3, domestic consumption goes down to Q4, and therefore after tariff, we can write this, after tariff, our level of imports become Q4 minus Q3. And also, more importantly, now the consumer surplus is basically going to be this area A, and I'm going to call this let's call this M, AM PW plus T. So AM PW plus T becomes my new consumer surplus. In fact, let me call this N, because PW plus T is too long. So AM N becomes my new consumer surplus. So in other words, what I'm trying to point out is just that this area PW B M N is a loss of consumer surplus. So what's the loss of consumer surplus? Loss of consumer surplus is PW B M N. And I'm going to zoom on this area. This area that we have is an important area now, because consumers are losing out in terms of all this region. And of all this region, I'm going to call this as area 1, and I will color it differently too. Let's call this as area 1. Let's call this area 2, 3 and 4. So just to clarify, area 1 is this region, area 2 is this, area 4 is this, area 3 is this blue region, and area 4 is already marked. So basically area 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, let me write this, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 is my loss of consumer surplus. And the reason why we're getting into this is because we will find questions in exams where they ask you, okay, what happens when you put a tariff? So first thing what happens is that when the consumer surplus goes down because the price has gone up from from PW to PW plus T, clearly some consumers are denied of the good. These Q2 minus Q4 consumers are denied of the good, and this area 4 is their loss of consumer surplus because they no longer can buy the good. So what is area 4? We say area 4 is basically loss of consumer surplus as Q2 minus Q4 consumers are denied of the good. And we call it a deadweight loss because this area isn't going to anyone. So area 4 doesn't go to either consumer or producer, and that's why I'm going to call it deadweight loss. Area 3, on the other hand, if you look at it, is this distance Q4 minus Q3, which is my level of imports now, times this distance, which is the amount of tax, PW plus T minus PW. So area 3 is actually what we call our tax or tariff revenue. Let me write this. It's a tariff revenue, and it is equal to T, which is the tax, times Q4 minus Q3, which is the level of import. So this is where area 3 is actually going to what we call government. The reason why I won't call it a deadweight loss is because there is a party in the society who gets this, and that party is government. Similarly, area 1 is what we call a rise in domestic producer surplus. It's domestic producers who are getting a higher surplus because now they can sell Q3 minus Q1 more. So look at this, guys. These domestic producers previously were only selling Q1, but now they're selling Q3 as well, and because of this excess selling, the Q3 minus Q1 is all of this area under the price above the supply curve is this extra area. Now area 1 goes to the producers who are now selling more. Are they efficient? And the answer is no, they are inefficient, and that is exactly why for us area 2 is basically what we call welfare loss, or you sometimes also call welfare loss due to Q3 minus Q1 inefficient producers producing more. So for us, Q3 minus Q1 is those producers who shouldn't have produced, because there are efficient producers out there in the world who should be producing, and because these guys are producing, these inefficient producers are producing, we end up causing a deadweight loss. So area 2 and 4 are basically what we call deadweight losses, and these are the losses which are not going to anyone. Area 1 is basically not a deadweight loss because domestic producers are pocketing this, and area 3 is being pocketed by the government. So if I quickly write a summary of my tariff, this is what I will write. So the summary could be something like this, where I say the price will rise by the amount of the tariff, causing lower imports. So once you put a tariff, the imports will go down. 2, consumers, domestic consumers lose out as domestic producers gain, because when you put a tariff, the good become expensive, making domestic consumers to lose out because the good is expensive, and domestic producers to gain because now they can become more competitive to the foreign market. And third is this, the government benefits in terms of tariff revenue, which means that government pockets that area 3, which is good. And the last one, number 4, is this, that the tariff is inefficient as it results in deadweight losses. The area 2 and area 4 were the deadweight losses that happen because some consumers are denied of the good and some inefficient producers are producing more. Let's now discuss quotas. So what are quotas? We say quotas are basically an alternative to tariffs, and a quota results in us to basically put a limit on imports of a commodity to a given volume. So we are restricting supply in order to basically have lower imports. Just like tariff, where the tariff was increasing the price and therefore the quantity went down, here we are restricting the quantity or lowering the quantity so that the price will go up. The end result is the same. In a quota, by restricting quantity, we are increasing the price and therefore lowering the quantity sold in the market. And there will be some differences in terms of who gains and who loses out in quota, but the end result is the same, that the price will go up, the quantity of imports will fall. Now let's see the diagram of quota. So let's say right now my demand and supply are such that PW is the level of imports, so PW becomes my world supply, and I'm right now importing Q2 minus Q1, which is 100 units of this good. So this is my world supply. Now, the government is unhappy, let's say, with this level of imports. They say it's just too much imports, and let's say they put a quota of 50. Quota of 50 means no longer there will be unrestricted supply, but only domestic producers will produce. Let me write this as S domestic, DOM, plus some quota will be allowed. So what I'm going to do is this, that I'm going to say this is no longer my world supply, no longer am I importing 100 units of this, but I'm going to import only 50, and therefore this domestic supply will now be shifted to the right by 50. Something like this will happen. This becomes my new supply curve, where this becomes my S dash, which is quota plus S domestic. So let me write this, that S dash is equal to my S domestic plus quota. So there is a rise in my supply by the amount of 50. Now what this means is that you said that because this no longer is your supply curve, we went to our domestic supply curve, and I'm saying that I'm only allowing 50 more cars and domestic producers will produce. So S domestic plus quota makes us our S dash, which means the new price will come from here. My new price in the domestic market will be P dash, of which this is my domestic consumption, Q3. In fact, let's call it Q4, and Q3 is my domestic production. So just like tariff, Q4 minus Q3 is my level of imports, and this level of imports is basically, we know this because we've already said it, this is our quota. So by restricting supply, we are ultimately having the same result. Look at this, guys. Consumer surplus previously was, let's say, A, B, PW. So all this was consumer surplus when the world price was PW. Now when you put a quota, you are now making this to be a new supply curve, S dash, which means this, that new consumer surplus will be A X P dash. And the reason why is this because now the domestic price will go to P dash, and therefore again area 1, 2, 3 and 4 is my loss of consumer surplus. Let me just color this region, area 3. This area 3 is my same area 3 as the last one, and this area 1 is again also same as last one, while area 2 and 4 we're saying they are deadweight losses. So just a quick comparison between tariffs and quotas. Consumer surplus will of course go down as the price is going up, but area 1 is now the same as the last time, where Q3 minus Q1 domestic producers surplus will rise. So area 1 is going to basically domestic producers in terms of higher producer surplus. But what about area 2 and 4? We say area 2 and 4, let me write this, area 2 and 4 are what we call deadweight losses, because some inefficient producers are producing more, which is Q3 minus Q1, but at the same time Q2 minus Q4 domestic consumers are denied of the good. So it's the same as the tariff story. What is different is, more importantly to understand, is your area 3. Area 3 we call our gain in importers revenue. Who are these importers? We say this, that area 3 goes to now importers who are importing this quota. So what has happened is basically that while the world sells let's say this good for PW, in, for example, our country the price is P dash, and therefore this extra price is what these guys get in order, who are now importing. So importers also gain in terms of area 3. So the difference between sort of tariff and quota is basically the area 3, while area 3 goes to government in terms of tariff revenue. When it comes to tariff, area 3 in quota is going to the importers in terms of extra revenue. So we need to remember this for our MCQs. The next thing we want to discuss is called voluntary export restraints. Voluntary export restraints are simply agreements between importing and exporting countries which limit the maximum amount of exports in a given period. So it is just like quota, but it's voluntary in nature. Let's say country A and country B, they have good terms with each other. So rather than putting a quota which is basically simply limit the imports, they can discuss it and they can say, you know what, I don't want you to import so many cars. I just want you to import, let's say, rather than 300 cars, how about you just import 150 cars? And let's say the country says, fine, we will do that, but why don't you also import less in our country? So these are like mutual agreements. The end result is the same as quota, but the fact that they are voluntary in nature means that countries are sort of not trying to destroy the relationship with each other. So voluntary export restraints is another kind of a quota, has the same kind of impact. The price will go up, the quantity will fall, consumer surplus will go down, and some importers will benefit just like quota. However, the difference is this, that it is voluntary, which means relationships between country may still remain amicable or friendly. Let's now discuss the third sort of method, which is called subsidies. So in the subsidies, what happens is that domestic producers are basically provided these subsidies to make them more competitive to imported goods. So I made a diagram here. Let's look at this diagram. When you give a subsidy to domestic producers, you're hoping that this level of imports should fall and they become more closer to PW. So let's say these are domestic producers. You give them subsidy, the supply curve will shift to the right like this. Supply curve shifts to the right because the subsidy results in cost of production to go down, and as a result of this subsidy, now we are looking at the level of imports to become not Q2 minus Q1 but Q2 minus, let's say, Q3. So this is the level of imports now, because domestic producers are more competitive. This is artificial, of course, way of making the domestic producers to become more competitive, and the result is basically there is an efficiency loss when it comes to taxpayers' money, but in a way we are now making our domestic producers to at least be able to match the foreign market prices. The next one we want to talk about is called excessive administrative burdens. Now, these are the regulatory barriers that are put sometimes by countries, which makes it difficult for importer to actually sell in the market. These standards or barriers are like, like having difficult product standards, requirements. Sometimes there's sanitary requirements or standards, sometimes there are pollution standards. All of those standards that you put in place, which are regulations which are required to be complied by the foreign firms, and when they comply that, the cost of production may go up so much that they end up not selling in the market. So these are the kind of like excessive administrative burden that are sometimes put into place in order to discourage producers to produce and sell in the market.